February 1944. Stalag Luft III, German-occupied Poland. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller dragged his metal detection wand across the floorboards of Barracks Block 104, listening for the telltale shriek that would expose another hidden contraband. His boots scraped against wood as he swept methodically beneath bunks, behind wall panels, inside the hollow posts that propped up these ramshackle buildings 24 inches off the frozen ground. For 3 hours, he and his team had torn through every corner of the north compound. They had confiscated a deck of playing cards with suspicious markings, a tin of coffee with a false bottom, 16 pencils sharpened to suspicious points. But no radio. There had to be a radio. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, was certain of it, because somehow, impossibly, the American and British prisoners knew things. They knew about the Eastern Front before the German guards did. They whispered about Allied bombing raids on Berlin while the ashes were still warm. They spoke of troop movements, naval engagements, political developments that had not yet appeared in any German newspaper. And when Müller returned to the guard barracks that evening, exhausted and empty-handed, he would learn that the prisoners had already published the day's BBC News in their underground camp newspaper. The headline read, "Soviet forces cross into Romania." The broadcast had aired 6 hours ago. The guards hadn't heard it, but the prisoners had. This is the story of one of the most remarkable intelligence operations of World War II. Not a tale of spies infiltrating enemy headquarters, or code-breakers cracking ciphers in secret bunkers, but of captured men who refused to surrender their minds even after their bodies were imprisoned. Armed with nothing but razor blades, pencil lead, and stolen copper wire, Allied prisoners of war built an invisible information network that spanned dozens of camps across Nazi-occupied Europe. They constructed radios so small they could hide inside hollow table legs, cigarette cartons, and soap dishes. They listened to the BBC while guards patrolled outside their windows. And they used that information not just to maintain hope, but to plan escapes, coordinate resistance, and ultimately to survive. The Germans confiscated every piece of electronic equipment they could find. They deployed metal detectors and X-ray machines. They assigned specialized counterintelligence officers called ferrets, whose sole job was to hunt for contraband. They threatened execution for anyone caught with a radio. None of it mattered, because you cannot confiscate human ingenuity, and in the desperate mathematics of survival, information was the most valuable currency of all. To understand why captured Allied servicemen risked their lives to hear radio broadcasts, you must first understand what the Germans were telling them instead. From the moment a prisoner arrived at a German camp, he was subjected to a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare. The Wehrmacht's propaganda ministry had designed an elaborate system to break prisoner morale through controlled information. Camps received a newspaper called the OK, short for Overseas Kid, published specifically for Allied POWs. It contained stories of German military victories, reports of Allied defeats, and carefully edited accounts of bombing raids that always emphasized civilian casualties. One issue might claim that London had been reduced to rubble,
Another would report that the American fleet had been destroyed in the Pacific. The camps also received regular broadcasts from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command, piped through loudspeakers in the barracks and common areas. These reports were designed to demoralize, to convince prisoners that the war was already lost, that their countries had abandoned them, that resistance was futile. "London is burning," the speakers would announce. "Your families are dead. Your cities are destroyed. Germany is winning on every front." For a newly captured airman or soldier, already reeling from the trauma of combat, capture, and the loss of his crew, this barrage of propaganda could be devastating. Without access to accurate information, how could a prisoner know what to believe? How could he maintain the will to resist when everything he heard suggested that resistance was pointless? The psychological effects of information isolation were profound. Camp doctors documented increases in depression, anxiety, and what they called barbed wire psychosis, a condition where prisoners became listless, withdrawn, and increasingly detached from reality. Men who believed their countries were losing, that liberation would never come, simply gave up. Some stopped eating. Others grew violent. A few attempted suicide. But there was another dimension to the information war that made access to news not just a matter of morale, but of survival. By 1943, rumors had begun circulating through the camps about what would happen to prisoners if Germany lost the war. Some guards, perhaps hoping to demoralize their captives, dropped hints about orders from Berlin regarding the final disposition of Allied POWs. Whether these rumors were true or not, and historical evidence suggests the SS did consider mass executions of prisoners, they created a terrifying uncertainty. If liberation was coming, prisoners needed to know, not just for hope, but for planning. If Allied forces were approaching a camp, prisoners might need to organize resistance, prevent guards from destroying evidence, or even coordinate with advancing troops. If the Germans were planning to evacuate a camp ahead of the Allied advance, prisoners needed to know whether to comply or to resist. The wrong decision could mean death. Information, quite literally, could mean the difference between life and death. The solution to the information problem emerged not from the laboratories of MI9 or MIS-X, though those organizations would eventually play a crucial role, but from the memories of men who had built amateur radios before the war. The principle was elegantly simple. A crystal radio, sometimes called a Foxhole radio, after the GIs who first improvised them at the Battle of Anzio in 1944, required no batteries, no vacuum tubes, no external power source whatsoever. It operated entirely on the energy contained in the radio waves themselves, captured by a simple wire antenna and converted into audible sound through a pair of high-impedance headphones. The heart of any crystal radio was the detector, a component that could convert the alternating current of a radio signal into the direct current needed to drive a headphone speaker. In commercial crystal radios, this detector was typically a piece of galena, lead sulfide, touched by a thin wire called a cat's whisker. But galena was impossible to obtain in a German prison camp. What the prisoners discovered, through experimentation born of desperation, was that a common safety razor blade could serve the same purpose. The blued steel blade, when touched at just the right angle by a sharpened pencil lead, created a crude semiconductor junction. The thin layer of oxide on the blade's surface, combined with the graphite of the pencil lead, formed what physicists call a point contact diode, a one-way valve for electrical current that could extract audio signals from radio waves. The physics were the same as those exploited by modern silicon diodes, just achieved with materials available in any prison camp barracks. The iron oxide on a razor blade and the carbon in a pencil lead created a junction where current could flow easily in one direction but not the other. This asymmetry was all that was needed to rectify a radio signal, to strip away the radio frequency carrier wave and extract the audio information it contained. To complete the circuit, the prisoners needed only 3 additional components: a coil of wire to serve as an inductor, an antenna to capture radio signals, and a pair of headphones to convert electrical current into sound. The coil could be wound from any available wire: telephone cable stolen during work details, copper stripped from electrical systems, even the wire from the camp's own barbed wire fences in some cases. Wrapped around a cardboard tube from a roll of toilet paper, this coil formed the tuning element of the radio, its inductance determining which frequencies the set could receive. The antenna was often the easiest component to improvise. Long runs of barbed wire surrounding the camp made excellent antennas. Prisoners simply had to find a way to connect to them without being detected. In some camps, metal bed frames were used. In others, prisoners ran thin wires along the rafters of their barracks, hidden in plain sight among the wooden beams. The headphones were the most difficult component to obtain. High impedance headphones, typically 2,000 to 4,000 ohms, were necessary to produce audible sound from the tiny currents generated by a crystal radio. Some prisoners managed to steal headphones from crashed aircraft or bribe guards to obtain them. Others built their own, winding thousands of turns of fine wire around iron nails to create crude but functional earpieces. One American POW in Vietnam, Richard Lucas, later documented how he built headphones by binding 4 nails together with cloth, winding wire, and dripping wax over the turns, then placing a tin can lid over the coil to serve as a diaphragm. The resulting radios were crude by any commercial standard. They could typically receive only one station, whatever powerful transmitter happened to be broadcasting nearby. They required constant adjustment, the pencil lead needing to be repositioned on the razor blade until it found the precise sweet spot where the junction would form. Reception was faint, often requiring listeners to press headphones tight against their ears and strain to hear through crackling static. But none of that mattered, because the station they could receive was the BBC.
The British Broadcasting Corporation's overseas service had been designed specifically to penetrate occupied Europe. With transmitters scattered across Britain and the Empire, broadcasting in 34 languages by 1940, the BBC deliberately aimed its most powerful signals directly at the continent. These transmissions were strong enough to be received hundreds of miles away, even on the most primitive crystal sets. For the BBC engineers, this was a calculated strategy. They understood that resistance fighters, civilians in occupied territories, and Allied prisoners all depended on their broadcasts for accurate information. So they increased power, improved antenna design, and repeated critical news bulletins multiple times throughout the day to ensure that even the weakest receivers could capture the information. For prisoners hunched over razor-blade radios in darkened barracks, this meant that the BBC's 9 o'clock news bulletin, beginning with the distinctive chimes of Big Ben, came through clearly enough to transcribe. Night after night, while guards patrolled outside, designated listeners would press crude headphones to their ears and write down everything they heard. But building a radio was only half the battle. Hiding it from the Germans was equally critical. The punishment for possessing a radio in a German POW camp was severe. Solitary confinement at minimum, execution at worst, depending on the camp commander and how the discovery was framed. German intelligence classified radio possession as espionage, which under the laws of war could carry a death sentence. So the prisoners developed elaborate concealment techniques. The Germans knew this, and so began a cat-and-mouse game that would last until the end of the war. The German counterintelligence officers assigned to hunt for contraband were called ferrets, Abwehr soldiers who wore distinctive blue coveralls and carried long-bladed screwdrivers for probing suspicious surfaces. Their job was to find tunnels, hidden documents, forged papers, and most importantly, radios. They crawled beneath the raised barracks, listening for sounds of digging. They examined every package that entered the camp. They conducted surprise inspections at all hours, tearing apart bedding and furniture in search of hidden compartments. The ferrets were good at their jobs. At Stalag Luft III, they discovered the famous Tom escape tunnel before it could be completed, collapsing months of careful work. They found maps hidden in playing cards, compasses concealed in uniform buttons, German currency sewn into clothing seams. They learned to recognize the telltale signs of contraband, suspicious bulges, panels that didn't quite fit, materials that seemed out of place. But they rarely found the radios. The prisoners had become masters of concealment. At Stalag Luft III, the camp's crystal radio was disassembled after each use and stored in pieces inside a hollow table leg. There was no obvious seam, no visible indication that the leg could be opened. Different prisoners carried different components, so that no single person possessed all the evidence needed to prove espionage. When the camp was evacuated in January 1945, during the Long March, 3 separate men each carried one piece of the dismantled radio. One British POW carried his radio hidden inside his bagpipe, an instrument the Germans searched repeatedly but never thought to disassemble. Other camps developed equally ingenious hiding places. At Stalag 17B in Austria, an American sergeant named James Cast built a crystal radio and concealed it inside a hollowed-out soap dish. The dish looked completely ordinary from the outside, standard-issue camp soap, slightly worn from use. But inside, invisible beneath the remaining soap, lay the components that connected the prisoners to the outside world. That radio would later inspire the 1953 film Stalag 17, earning William Holden an Academy Award. At Stalag Luft I on the Baltic coast, prisoners hid radio components in spaces they knew the Germans would never search. The camp's X Committee, responsible for security and intelligence, posted guards whenever the radio was in use, watching for approaching ferrets. If a search began, the radio could be disassembled and scattered among a dozen different hiding places within minutes. The Germans suspected a radio existed. They searched repeatedly. They never found it. While POWs demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in building radios from scratch, they were not entirely alone. Two organizations, Britain's MI9 and America's MIS-X, had been established specifically to assist captured Allied servicemen, and among their most important activities was smuggling radio components into German camps. MI9 came first, established in December 1939 under the leadership of Major Norman Crocat. The organization's mission was twofold: help prisoners escape and maintain communication with those who remained in captivity. To accomplish the second objective, MI9 developed an elaborate system for concealing escape and communication aids inside seemingly innocent packages sent to POW camps. The key was to avoid using Red Cross parcels, which were protected by the Geneva Convention and whose compromise would have endangered the entire humanitarian supply system. Instead, MI9 created fictitious charitable organizations, names like the Prisoners' Welfare Fund and the Servicemen's Relief Association, and shipped packages under these covers. The packages contained items that would raise no suspicion: board games, sporting equipment, musical instruments, books, toiletries. But hidden within these innocent objects were the tools of resistance. A wooden cribbage board might contain radio components nestled in hollowed-out chambers beneath the playing surface. X-ray photographs taken by American investigators after the war show these boards clearly, their internal compartments packed with vacuum tubes, resistors, and wire coils. Everything needed to build a working receiver. Baseball manufacturers cooperated with MIS-X by winding specially designed capsules into color-coded balls, each capsule containing a different radio component that could be extracted and assembled. Checkerboards were steamed apart to reveal maps and documents layered inside them. Ping-pong paddles concealed compasses in their handles. Shaving brushes had false bottoms hiding miniaturized radio parts. Even cigarette cartons were used. Manufacturers agreed to produce special batches that contained crystal radio receivers hidden among the tobacco. The Gillette Razor Company contributed to the effort in a particularly elegant way. They magnetized their double-edged razor blades so that when balanced on a piece of string, the G in the Gillette logo would point due north, creating an improvised compass. The same blades, of course, could be used as detectors in crystal radios. The system for getting these packages to the right prisoners was equally sophisticated. MI9 and MIS-X established coded communication with POW camps through apparently innocent letters. Prisoners who had been briefed before capture, typically radio operators and intelligence officers, knew what to look for. When a package from a particular fictional organization arrived, or when a letter contained certain coded phrases, the briefed prisoners would know to intercept it before the Germans could examine it too closely. At its peak in 1944, MIS-X was sending 120 parcels per day to German POW camps. The operation became so successful that coded messages from the camps eventually asked the agencies to stop. The prisoners were simply running out of hiding places to store all the equipment they had received. When the Germans finally began using X-ray machines to scan incoming packages in 1944, they discovered the elaborate concealment system. But by then, most camps already had their radios. The damage, from the German perspective, was done. Getting the news was only the beginning. The greater challenge was distributing that information to thousands of prisoners without alerting the Germans. Each camp developed its own system, but the principles were similar everywhere. A small group of trusted prisoners, typically those with intelligence or communications backgrounds, were responsible for operating the radio and transcribing broadcasts. This group was kept deliberately small to minimize the risk of betrayal or accidental revelation. After each broadcast, the transcribed news was passed to a reader, someone with a good memory who could memorize the key points. The reader would then visit different barracks throughout the camp, reciting the news to small groups of prisoners. The written transcription was destroyed immediately after memorization, often eaten by the reader himself, leaving no physical evidence. In some camps, this verbal distribution system was supplemented by underground newspapers. At Stalag Luft I, the powwow, standing for Prisoners of War Waiting on Winning, grew from a single typed page to an 8-page Sunday supplement. The paper contained transcribed BBC news, editorials, poetry, and even cartoons mocking the German guards. By 1945, it had become a daily publication, churned out on hidden typewriters and distributed through a network of trusted prisoners. The risk of publishing such a newspaper was enormous. Discovery would mean not just punishment for the editors, but proof that a radio existed somewhere in the camp. Yet the powwow continued publication from May 1944 until liberation in May 1945. An entire year of daily news, printed and distributed under the noses of German guards who knew something was happening but could never prove it. On June 6, 1944, the system proved its worth. In the early morning hours, prisoners at camps across Germany heard the BBC's announcement of Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. Within hours, the news had spread through every compound. American prisoners at Stalag Luft I couldn't contain their excitement. They whooped and cheered so loudly that the German guards, who hadn't yet received any official notification, were mystified by the celebration. The powwow printed a special edition that day. The headline read simply, "Invasion." For prisoners who had spent months or years hearing German propaganda about the impending collapse of the Allied war effort, the D-Day announcement was more than news. It was vindication. The Germans had told them London was burning, that Britain was defeated, that America would never come. Now they could hear with their own ears, from a source they trusted, that the liberation of Europe had begun. The psychological impact was immeasurable. Suicide attempts dropped. Morale soared. Men who had retreated into depression and despair suddenly found reason to hope, to plan, to survive. The doctors who had documented barbed wire psychosis watched their patients recover almost overnight. In the months that followed, Prisoners tracked the Allied advance across France with maps hidden in the walls of their barracks. They knew when Paris was liberated. They knew when the Allies crossed the Rhine. They knew, with increasing certainty, that liberation was coming. Perhaps nowhere was the value of radio intelligence more dramatically demonstrated than at Stalag Luft I in the final days of the war. By late April 1945, Soviet forces were approaching the camp from the east. German authorities faced a decision: evacuate the prisoners westward, away from the advancing Red Army, or abandon the camp entirely. Other camps had already been evacuated in what became known as the Long March, brutal forced marches in winter conditions that killed hundreds of prisoners through exposure, exhaustion, and execution. But the prisoners at Stalag Luft I knew something the Germans didn't realize they knew. Through their secret radio, they had been tracking the Soviet advance in real time. They knew that evacuation would mean marching directly into active combat zones. They knew that the war was days, perhaps hours, from ending. And they knew that if they could simply wait, liberation would come to them. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, the senior American officer at Stalag Luft I, made a decision that would have been impossible without accurate intelligence. When German authorities ordered the evacuation of the camp on April 30th, 1945, Zemke refused to give the order. The confrontation that followed became one of the most remarkable moments of POW history. Zemke, fluent in German thanks to his immigrant parents, negotiated directly with Commandant Oberst Gustav Warnstedt. He argued that evacuation would lead to unnecessary deaths on both sides. He pointed out, though he couldn't reveal his source, that the war was effectively over. He offered a gentleman's agreement. The German guards would leave, the prisoners would remain, and there would be no violence on either side. Warnstedt, perhaps sensing the hopelessness of the German position, agreed. On the night of April 30th, the German guards simply walked away, leaving 9,000 Allied prisoners in control of their own camp. The next morning, Soviet tanks rolled through the front gates. The prisoners had won their final battle through information. While other camps were being force-marched across Germany, losing men to exhaustion and violence, the prisoners of Stalag Luft I waited in place, confident in their knowledge that liberation was imminent. That confidence came from a razor blade, a pencil lead, and a coil of stolen wire. The story of POW's secret radios extends beyond Europe. In the Pacific Theater, where the brutality of Japanese camps made German stalags seem almost humane by comparison, prisoners faced even greater challenges in maintaining contact with the outside world. The Japanese had not ratified the Geneva Convention and showed little concern for the welfare of their captives. Prisoners in camps like Cabanatuan in the Philippines received starvation rations, faced routine beatings, and witnessed executions for minor infractions. Possessing a radio was not just forbidden, it was a death sentence if discovered. Yet American prisoners built radios anyway. Captain Russell Hutchison, an Army officer interned at Cabanatuan, constructed one of the war's most ingenious clandestine receivers. His design wasn't a simple crystal set. The Japanese camps were too far from friendly transmitters for crystal radios to be practical. Instead, Hutchison built a single-tube regenerative receiver, far more sensitive than any crystal set, capable of picking up short-wave broadcasts from as far away as San Francisco. The challenge was concealment. Hutchison's solution was to build the entire radio inside a standard GI canteen. The canteen looked completely ordinary from the outside, dented, scratched, the kind of item a prisoner might carry without attracting attention. But inside, hidden in a hollowed-out chamber, lay a complete shortwave receiver with tuning coils wound on bamboo forms, a vacuum tube powered by batteries concealed in a separate bamboo tube, and connections for a hidden antenna. The radio picked up station KGEI from San Francisco, a powerful shortwave broadcaster that the prisoners called KG. Through this connection, the men of Cabanatuan knew that American forces were island-hopping across the Pacific, drawing closer to the Philippines. They knew that liberation was possible. More importantly, they knew that they might need to escape. Rumors circulated that Japanese commanders had orders to execute all prisoners before allowing them to be liberated. If American forces approached the camp, the prisoners needed warning, time to organize a breakout before the guards could carry out any final orders. That warning came on January 30th, 1945, when American Rangers and Filipino guerrillas launched a daring raid on Cabanatuan. The raid succeeded in liberating over 500 prisoners, but its timing was not coincidental. Intelligence from the camp's radio network, passed through the Filipino resistance, had helped coordinate the operation. The prisoners knew when to be ready, knew when to stay low, knew when to run. When historians calculate the impact of the POW radio networks, the statistics are impressive. Of the roughly 94,000 American servicemen held in German camps during World War II, 737 successfully escaped and made it back to Allied lines. Countless more attempted escapes that, while unsuccessful, tied down German resources and contributed to the Allied war effort. But the true impact of the secret radios cannot be measured in escape statistics alone. The radios maintained morale in conditions designed to break human spirits. They provided accurate information that countered enemy propaganda. They allowed prisoners to plan, to organize, to maintain their identity as soldiers rather than mere captives. Perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that imprisonment could not silence the human need for truth. The Germans could confiscate equipment. They could threaten execution. They could search, probe, X-ray, and interrogate. But they could not prevent men with knowledge of basic electronics from assembling the components of resistance from razor blades and pencil lead. The POW radio operators came home after the war and largely returned to ordinary lives. Some became engineers. Others went into business. A few wrote memoirs that preserved their experiences for history. The crystal radios they built have mostly been lost, fragile things made of scrounged materials designed to be destroyed at a moment's notice. But replicas exist in museums today, built by amateur radio enthusiasts who wanted to understand how men under unimaginable pressure created something
from nothing. If you ever get the chance to see one, to hold a recreation of a Foxhole radio in your hands, take a moment to appreciate what it represents. It represents defiance. It represents ingenuity. It represents the refusal to surrender, even when surrender seems to be the only option. The Germans told their prisoners that London was burning. The prisoners built radios from razor blades and proved them wrong. And when the war ended, when the camps were liberated and the men came home, they carried with them a truth that transcended the specific circumstances of their imprisonment. You can cage a man's body. You cannot cage his mind. If this story resonated with you, if you want to hear more about the incredible technological innovations and desperate improvisations that shaped World War II, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next documentary. Drop a comment below telling us which aspect of the POW radio story surprised you most. Was it the razor blade detector, the smuggled components in baseballs, or the audacious newspaper published under German noses? Your support helps us continue bringing these forgotten stories of ingenuity and courage to life. Share this video with anyone who appreciates the intersection of technology, history, and human determination. Until next time, this is Warline, where we reveal the shocking truths that textbooks left behind.